They invited her to the wedding as a joke. They wanted to see her cry. They wanted to see her broken. But when the cathedral doors groaned open, the laughter didn't just stop, it died. Because Alara didn't come to beg. And she didn't come alone. The groom looked at the woman he threw away, the most dreaded Mafia boss in the city standing beside her, and finally, at the 3 timber wolves unchained at her feet. In that split second, Luca realized the invitation wasn't a prank anymore. It was a death sentence. What happens when a predator walks into a room full of prey? You might want to look away, but you won't be able to. Stay with me until the end, because what Alara does when she reaches the altar doesn't just stop the wedding. It burns the Whitmore legacy to the ground. Before we witness the takedown, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment what you would do if your ex invited you to their wedding just to mock you. Would you burn the invitation? Or would you show up and burn the wedding? Now, let's get into the story. 2 years had passed since Alara Constantine was escorted out of the Whitmore estate like a criminal, clutching a trash bag of her clothes while Luca watched from the balcony, too cowardly to even say goodbye. She was a different woman now. The morning air at the Hale compound was biting, carrying the metallic scent of snow and raw meat. Alara stood in the center of the paddock, her breath misting in the cold. She wasn't wearing the beige cardigans Luca's mother had forced her into. She was in black tactical gear, her platinum bob sharp as a blade against her jaw. "Draven, hold," she commanded, her voice low and steady. 10 feet away, a massive timber wolf froze mid-stride. His amber eyes locked onto hers, his lips pulled back to reveal teeth capable of snapping a femur. Beside him, 2 younger wolves, shadow-dark and restless, mimicked his stillness. They were predators, killers by nature, but they watched Alara with the devotion of acolytes. A nervous courier approached the fence, his hand trembling as he held out a thick, cream-colored envelope. He didn't dare enter the paddock. Alara signaled the pack to stay and walked to the fence. She took the envelope, her gloved fingers tracing the expensive gold leaf of the return address. Asterisk the Whitmore estate, asterisk. She tore it open. Inside wasn't an apology. It was a wedding invitation. Luca Whitmore and Bianca Harrington invite you to celebrate their union. And handwritten at the bottom, in Eleanor Whitmore's sharp, spidery script. We thought you might want to see what a traditional wife looks like. Do come, dear. It won't be a family without the mistakes present. It was a taunt. A final, petty attempt to remind Alara that she was the discarded object, the barren soil where nothing grew. They expected her to burn it. Or worse, to cry over it. A heavy hand rested on her shoulder. Alara didn't flinch. She leaned back into the solid warmth of the man standing behind her. Dominic Hale, the city shadow king, smelled of expensive cigars and gunpowder. He reached over and took the invitation from her hand, his knuckles tattooed with symbols that made grown men cross the street to avoid him. He read the card once. His expression didn't change, but the air around them seemed to darken. Dominic looked at the wolves, who were now watching him with expectant energy, and then down at the woman who had walked into his life broken and rebuilt herself into a weapon. "They think they're summoning a victim," Dominic said, his voice a deep rumble that vibrated against her spine. He crumpled the heavy cardstock in one fist. Alara looked up at him. "Eleanor wants a show? She wants me to show up in black, mourning the loss of her son." Dominic smirked, a terrifying expression that promised violence without lifting a finger. He tossed the crumpled paper to Draven, who snatched it out of the air and shredded it in a single bite. "No black," Dominic said softly, turning to walk back toward the house. "Let's wear red." The wedding morning arrived wrapped in gold light and expensive promises, a stark contrast to the cold, metallic dawn at the Hale compound. The Whitmore Cathedral was a fortress of white lilies and ancient stone, designed to intimidate as much as it was to celebrate. In the groom's private vestry, Luca Whitmore stared at his reflection in the antique mirror, but the face looking back didn't look like a man about to claim his happiness. It looked like a man waiting for a sentencing hearing. He fumbled with his silk bow tie, his fingers clumsy and cold. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the invitation. The cream cardstock. The gold lettering. The cruelty of it. "We shouldn't have sent it," Luca whispered to the empty room, the words tasting like ash. The heavy oak door creaked open, and Eleanor Whitmore swept in, a vision in champagne satin and aggressive perfumery. She didn't knock. Eleanor never knocked in buildings she paid for. "Luca, darling, stand still," she scolded, swatting his hands away to fix his tie herself. Her touch was precise, efficient, and entirely lacking in warmth. "You look like you're about to be sick. Pull yourself together. The senator is already here." Luca pulled away, pacing the small room. The nervous energy was eating him alive, a gnawing rat in his gut. "I'm serious, mother. Inviting Alara, it was a mistake." Eleanor laughed, a light, tinkling sound that grated against Luca's nerves. She picked up a lint roller and began aggressively grooming his shoulder. "Oh, please, don't tell me you're still afraid of that little mouse. It's been 2 years, Luca. She's probably living in some studio apartment, knitting sweaters for stray cats." "She didn't RSVP," Luca said, stopping to look at her. Radio silence. "That's not like her. Alara always followed the rules." "Exactly." Eleanor smiled, stepping back to admire her work. "She didn't RSVP because she's mortified. She's sitting at home right now, staring at that invitation, realizing exactly how far she's fallen since we cut her loose. That was the point, darling. To remind her of her place." Luca walked to the window, looking down at the guests arriving in black limousines. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe that Alara was still the quiet, eager-to-please girl he had married because she was safe. But a cold shiver worked its way down his spine, a primal warning that his mother was ignoring. "She has too much shame to show her face here," Eleanor declared, checking her makeup in the mirror. "She knows she can't compete with Bianca. Bianca is perfection. Alara was just a placeholder." She turned to leave, pausing at the door with a dismissive wave. "Stop worrying. The only thing walking through those doors today is your future." Luca turned back to the window. He pressed his forehead against the cold glass, watching the road. "I hope you're right," he whispered. But deep down, where the fear lived, he knew she wasn't. Luca's fear was well-founded. Across the city, in the master suite of the Hale estate, Alara was proving him right. The dress hung on a mannequin like a wound in the air, a slash of deep, oxblood crimson against the stark white of the dressing room. It wasn't a garment designed for celebration. It was designed for conquest. Structured, architectural, and devastatingly expensive. Alara stepped into the silk, the fabric cooling her skin. She turned to the floor-length mirror. The woman looking back wasn't the girl who had cried in the Whitmore driveway. That girl was dead. This woman was a blade, sheathed in velvet. She reached for the long, black opera gloves. Slowly, methodically, she pulled the left one up her arm, smoothing the satin over her skin. Then the right. The motion felt ritualistic, like an assassin taping her knuckles before a fight. She wasn't just dressing for a wedding. She was covering her hands so she wouldn't leave fingerprints on the wreckage she was about to cause. Behind her, the reflection shifted. Dominic Hale entered the room, the heavy thud of his boots absorbed by the plush carpet. He was dressed in a black bespoke suit, the collar of his shirt open to reveal the ink creeping up his neck. He wasn't alone. Draven, the massive alpha timber wolf, padded to his side. The animal didn't pant or pace. He stood with the terrifying stillness of a loaded gun. Dominic knelt on one knee, not to Alara, but to the wolf. In his hand, he held a heavy chain. It wasn't steel or iron. It was solid, 24-karat gold, thick enough to anchor a boat. He clicked the leash onto Draven's leather collar. "Easy," Dominic murmured, running a tattooed hand over the wolf's thick, gray fur. He stood up, holding the gold chain loosely in his hand. It was a lie, of course. A gold chain wouldn't hold a 200-pound timber wolf if it decided to kill. The chain wasn't a restraint. It was jewelry. It was a signal to the world that they had tamed the untamable. Dominic looked at Alara in the mirror. His dark eyes traveled from the hem of her blood-red gown to the sharp line of her platinum bob. He didn't smile. He looked at her with the pride of a man who had sharpened a knife and was finally letting it cut. "You look like a heart attack," he said, his voice low and rough. Alara adjusted the neckline of her dress, her gloved fingers dark against her pale skin. She turned to face him, the three wolves now flanking them in a perfect, predatory triangle. "Good," Alara replied, her voice devoid of mercy. "Let's go stop one." The drive to the cathedral was a blur of darkened glass and silent anticipation, but inside the Whitmore sanctuary, time seemed to have curdled. The air was thick with the scent of white lilies, thousands of them, drowning the altar in a fragrance that smelled less like a celebration and more like a funeral parlor. Luca stood at the altar, his hands clasped behind his back to hide the tremors. He looked out at the sea of faces, 500 of the city's elite, packed into the pews like expensive sardines in a tin. They were the same people who had whispered when he married Alara, and the same people who had nodded approvingly when he divorced her. They were a cage of judgment, and Luca had spent his entire life rattling the bars, begging for approval. The organ groaned, signaling the bride's entrance. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the church swung open, but only enough to admit Bianca. She floated down the aisle, a vision of curated perfection. Her lace gown was modest, her veil was long, and her smile was plastered on with the terrifying rigidity of a pageant queen. She was everything his mother wanted, pliable, pedigreed, and safe. Luca watched her approach, and he felt nothing, just a hollow echo where his heart used to be. The ceremony began with the drone of the bishop's voice, reciting the same ancient, dusty vows that had bound Whitmore men to miserable marriages for generations. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today." The guests sat in polite silence, fans fluttering in the stuffy air. They were bored. They checked their watches, thinking about the reception, the open bar, the gossip they would trade over canapes. They were safe in their bubble of tradition, protected by the heavy stone walls and the security team stationed outside. They had no idea that the security team had already been quietly neutralized. They had no idea that the safety of this room was an illusion. As Bianca reached the altar and took Luca's hand, her palm was clammy. She looked up at him, her eyes wide and expectant, waiting for him to play his part in the script. "Do you, Luca Whitmore, take this woman?" The bishop intoned, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. It was a script written by dead men, performed by living puppets. It was restrictive. It was suffocating. It was a lie. And then, just as the bishop drew a breath to ask for objections, a formality no one ever took seriously, the heavy vibration of a car engine cut through the silence outside. Not a limousine. Something deeper. Something that growled. The air in the cathedral seemed to shift, the pressure dropping as if a storm had suddenly materialized directly above the steeple. Luca's head snapped up. He knew that sound. The guests didn't hear it yet. They were still watching the bride, still trapped in the dull, gray monotony of their expectations. But Luca felt the hair on his arm stand up. The cage door wasn't just unlocked. It was about to be ripped off its hinges. The bishop's words died in his throat, cut off by a sound that had no place in a house of God. It wasn't a shout or a gunshot. It was the heavy, groaning protest of ancient hinges being forced beyond their limit. The massive oak doors at the back of the cathedral didn't just swing open. They were thrown wide, slamming against the stone walls with a violence that shook the dust from the rafters. A draft of biting winter air swept down the nave, extinguishing the votive candles in a single, shivering breath. The organist faltered, his hands slipping on the keys to produce a discordant, ugly shriek that echoed into silence. Every head turned. 500 necks craned toward the entrance, expecting a late guest, a drunken relative, or perhaps a security breach. What they saw froze the blood in their veins. First came the sound. Click, click, click. The rhythmic, terrifying tapping of hard claws on polished marble. 3 timber wolves stepped across the threshold, their massive shoulders rolling with predatory grace. They didn't pant or bark. They moved in absolute silence, their amber eyes scanning the terrified crowd as if selecting cuts of meat. Behind them, holding the golden chain that linked the pack, walked Dominic Hale. The sight of him sucked the oxygen out of the room. The tattoos creeping up his neck, the bespoke black suit that cost more than the church's restoration fund, the sheer, undeniable aura of a man who owned the police force. It was a nightmare made flesh. But Dominic was just the escort. Walking beside him, her hand resting lightly on the crook of his arm, was Alara. Gasps rippled through the pews like a physical wave. She wasn't wearing the muted pastels of a guest. She was wearing a gown of violent, blood-red silk that pooled around her feet and clung to her silhouette like a second skin. In a sea of white lilies, cream lace, and polite beige, she was a slash of crimson war paint. She stood framed by the light of the open doors, the red dress vibrating against the stark whiteness of the bridal runner. She looked regal. She looked dangerous. She looked like the only living thing in a room full of ghosts. Bianca, standing at the altar, let out a small, strangled whimper, her hands flying to her mouth. The contrast was brutal. The bride in her delicate, innocent white looked suddenly childish, a paper doll about to be burned. Alara didn't blink. She didn't look at the guests who had shunned her. Her gaze was fixed forward, locking onto Luca's terrified eyes across the expanse of the cathedral. She took a step, and the wolves moved with her, a single organism of fur, teeth, and vengeance. The wedding was over. The hunt had begun. Alara moved. Her heel struck the white runner, a soft thud that echoed like a gavel striking a sounding block. She didn't rush. Queens didn't run. They processed. To her left, Dominic matched her pace, his presence a wall of dark gravity that bent the room toward him. To her right, the wolves flowed like liquid smoke, their massive shoulders brushing against the pews, their panting the only sound in the suffocated air. A burly man in a headset, the head of the Whitmore's private security, stepped out from behind a pillar near the third row. He reached for his belt, his eyes fixed on the animals. He had orders to stop disturbances. He had a taser. He had an ego. Then he looked up. Dominic Hale didn't stop walking. He simply turned his head, locking eyes with the guard. It was a look devoid of humanity, cold, flat, and promising a violence that would not end with a lawsuit. The guard froze. He recognized the tattoos creeping up Dominic's collar. He recognized the face that had been on the front page of the Gazette under headlines that used words like untouchable and acquitted. The guard's hand dropped from his belt. He took a stumbled step back, pressing himself into the shadows, making himself small. He chose life. Dominic smirked, a microscopic twitch of his lip, and faced forward again. The message was received. We walk where we want. The guests in the aisle seats weren't as lucky as the guard. They were trapped. Mrs. Gable, the town's most notorious gossip, the woman who had loudly called Alara barren at a charity luncheon 3 years ago, clutched her pearl necklace, leaning away as the black wolf trotted past. Her fear smelled sour, pungent in the heavy air, and she let out a high-pitched squeak of terror. The wolf didn't like the sound. It whipped its head around, jaws snapping the air inches from Mrs. Gable's expensive lace sleeve. The clack of teeth meeting was louder than a gunshot. Mrs. Gable slumped against her husband in a dead faint, but no one moved to help her. No one dared to break the stillness. Alara kept her eyes on the altar. She could see Luca now, really see him. He was sweating, his thin skin turning a sickly shade of gray. He looked like a man waking up from a dream to find a knife at his throat. She saw his eyes dart to the wolves, then to Dominic, and finally, inevitably, to her. She saw the recognition hit him. He wasn't looking at his ex-wife anymore. He was looking at his executioner, and she was breathtaking. Alara didn't stop until the hem of her blood-red gown brushed the bottom step of the altar. The distance between her and the couple was less than 10 feet, but the chasm between their worlds was infinite. Bianca, the perfect, porcelain doll of a bride, finally broke. She scrambled backward, her heels catching on the layers of her lace train. A high, thin sound escaped her throat, not a scream, but the desperate, involuntary noise of a prey animal realizing the fence is gone. She clutched Luca's arm, her knuckles white, pulling him back as if he could shield her from the monsters at their feet. "Luca!" she shrieked, her voice cracking the heavy silence. "Do something. Get them out." But Luca Whitmore couldn't move. He was a statue carved from panic. He wasn't looking at the wolves. He wasn't even looking at Alara. His gaze was locked on the man standing beside her. Luca knew faces. He knew the faces of senators, of bankers, of men who could ruin your credit score. But he also knew the face of the man who could ruin your life without ever signing a document. He had seen Dominic Hale across crowded rooms at underground poker games he wasn't supposed to be at. He knew the rumors. He knew that when Dominic Hale showed up, people didn't just get fired, they vanished. The color drained from Luca's face, leaving him a sickly, waxen gray. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The boutonniere on his lapel, a perfect white rose, seemed to wilt under the radiating heat of Dominic's stare. Dominic didn't speak. He didn't have to. He simply adjusted his cufflinks, the gold flashing in the candlelight, and offered Luca a small, terrifying nod. I see you. The message hit Luca like a physical blow. His knees buckled slightly. Then, slowly, terrified to look but unable to stop himself, Luca turned his eyes to Alara. He expected to see anger. He expected to see the tear-streaked, desperate woman he had thrown out of his house 2 years ago. He was prepared for her rage. He had a script for that. He could call her crazy. He could call security. But Alara wasn't angry. She stood tall, her posture impeccable, her face a mask of bored, icy indifference. She looked at him not with hatred, but with the mild curiosity of a scientist observing a bug under a microscope. She was vibrant, alive, and terrifyingly whole. In her red gown, flanked by beasts and monsters, she made the white-clad couple look like children playing dress-up. She was the queen on the chessboard. He was just a pawn who had forgotten he could be taken. The silence stretched, thin and agonizing, until the only sound in the massive cathedral was the wet, rhythmic panting of the wolf at Alara's feet, staring up at Luca's throat. The silence stretched until it was brittle, a physical weight pressing down on the altar. The only sound was the wet, rhythmic panting of the wolf at Alara's feet, its amber eyes fixed on Luca's jugular. Alara finally moved. She reached into her clutch, a small, velvet movement that made the security guards flinch, their hands twitching toward holsters they were too terrified to draw. Luca's breath hitched, a pathetic, strangled sound. He thought it was a gun. He thought this was the end. But Alara didn't pull out a weapon. She pulled out a ring. It was a modest diamond, small and dull compared to the rocks flashing on the hands of the guests in the front row. It was the ring Luca had given her 5 years ago, the symbol of a promise he had broken the moment it became inconvenient. She held it up, the metal catching the light. You invited me here to teach me a lesson, didn't you, Luca? Her voice was soft, melodic, and carried to the back of the cathedral without a microphone. You wanted me to see your happiness. You wanted me to see what I had lost. She took a step closer. The wolf growled low in its throat, a vibration that rattled Luca's bones, but Alara rested a gloved hand on the animal's head, silencing it instantly. I saw it, she whispered, her eyes boring into his. I saw your fear. I saw your mother's vanity. I saw a room full of people who only love you when you're winning. She turned the ring over in her fingers, then let it drop. Clink. It hit the marble floor with a sound that seemed deafening in the quiet church. It rolled, wobbling on its edge, before coming to rest at the toe of Bianca's pristine white satin shoe. You wanted me to see your happiness, Alara repeated, her voice hardening into steel. So it's only fair I brought my own. She turned slightly, extending her hand. Dominic Hale, the man who made mayors tremble, stepped forward. He didn't grab her wrist. He took her hand with a reverence that bordered on worship. He bowed his head, pressing a kiss to her gloved knuckles, a public declaration of submission that shattered the hierarchy of the entire city. The syndicate is under new management, Luca, Alara said, the reveal hitting the room like a shockwave. Dominic doesn't give the orders anymore. I do. Luca stared at her, his mind fracturing. The rumors of the Shadow Queen, who had been restructuring the underworld, the ruthlessness, the strategy, the sudden disappearance of the Hale family's enemies. It wasn't Dominic. It was her. He hadn't discarded a wife. He had unleashed a monarch. Enjoy the wedding, Alara said, a cruel, beautiful smile finally touching her lips. I'd stay for the cake, but I have an empire to run. Alara spun on her heel, the red silk of her gown flaring out like a pool of blood before settling back into its perfect architectural lines. She didn't wait for a response. There was nothing left to say to a man who had become a footnote in her biography. Dominic rose from his bow, casting one last, pitying glance at the groom, before falling into step beside her. The wolves turned in unison, their claws clicking against the marble as they flanked their queen. They walked back up the aisle, the sea of guests parting like the Red Sea, terrified to even breathe too loudly. As they reached the heavy oak doors, Draven, the massive gray alpha, paused. He looked back at the altar, at the trembling bride and the pale groom, and threw his head back. Aru. The howl tore through the cathedral, a primal, mournful sound that vibrated in the stained glass and settled deep in the bones of every person in the room. It wasn't a threat, it was a dismissal. It was the sound of the wild leaving the tame behind. Then, they were gone. The heavy doors slammed shut with a finality that echoed like a tomb ceiling. For a long minute, no one moved. The organist, shaking, tried to restart the wedding march, but the notes sounded thin and pathetic in the heavy air. The spell of the perfect day was shattered, replaced by the cold reality of what had just walked out. Bianca was sobbing now, quiet, ugly tears that smeared her expensive makeup. She looked down at the cheap diamond ring lying near her shoe, the symbol of the life Luca had given Alara, the life he was now giving her. Luca didn't comfort her. He couldn't take his eyes off the closed doors. Around him, the ceremony limped back to life. The bishop cleared his throat nervously. His mother, Eleanor, was already whispering furiously to a senator's wife, trying to spin the disaster into an anecdote, her face a mask of desperate damage control. But Luca didn't hear them. The air in the church felt stale, recycled, suffocating. He looked at his bride, safe, predictable, shrinking, and then he thought of Alara. He thought of the steel in her spine, the diamonds at her throat, the way the most dangerous man in the city bowed to her. He had invited her to show her what she was missing. Instead, she had shown him what he had thrown away. He was the king of this small, polite, beige hill. But Alara? Alara was the wolf at the door, and she had just eaten the world. Luca closed his eyes as the vows continued, realizing with a sick, sinking feeling that he wasn't standing at an altar. He was standing in a cage, and he had just locked himself in.